Hello. I would like to begin by thanking MFA Director Ellen Mueller, Assistant Kylie Van Note, my mentor Dana Kohler, my thesis committee of Sam Calda and Brian Bertigan, my MFA cohort, and my family and friends. A Lie That Tells the Truth: The Art and Adventure of Young Adult Literature. A book is an invitation into the unknown. The experience of fiction, much like travel, is an experience of change. The act of venturing beyond the familiar propels us towards knowledge and empathy. The hero's journey, there and back again, and forever changed. My name is Kate Gunther. I'm an artist, illustrator, writer, and theater maker, all titles that fall under the identity of storyteller. No matter what form my practice takes, at the heart of it all is narrative. Art is a vehicle for story and a place in which we can celebrate the simplest and grandest parts of our humanity while also dreaming of yet unseen possibilities. Continuing in the legacy of the stories and adventures that informed who I am today, my thesis work manifests itself in the form of a written and illustrated story, an invitation in the form of a book. As humans, we build our personal and collective identities through the stories that we collect and share, sourcing inspiration in those who have sought the unknown or imagined beyond the understood. Author J.R.R. Tolkien, best known for The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, described fantasy as freedom from the domination of observed fact, made credible by a glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. Author and illustrator Chris Van Allsburg describes fantasy in his work as the idea of the extraordinary happening in the context of the ordinary. The exceptional potential in the everyday is where fantasy is most formidable. I want to tell stories that allow for that magic, that recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary, and are intrinsically tied to recognizable truth. For my thesis project, I am writing and illustrating a young adult novel. My story follows 11-year-old Charlotte Fincher Cragen, known as Chuck, on an unexpected adventure, introducing her to historical figures from the world of science and exploration. Chuck's journey takes place in the fantastical rooms of the Peregrination Explorers Club, a once flourishing institution now fallen to ruin. Amid the historic halls, Chuck finds herself transported in space and time as the club transforms around her into the various adventures of its former members. Along the way, she meets real-life adventurers during their own moments of trial and determination, as she endeavors to find her way home and perhaps save the club from peril along the way. It is a story of adventure and exploration and of facing the unknown with bravery and perseverance. By showcasing real explorers and scientists, I aim to highlight the potential of humanity and give voice to the forgotten. We are drawn towards stories that celebrate the best of what we can be, often against the greatest challenges. Stories such as that of Sir Ernest Shackleton, whose journeys are not remembered for their successes, but rather their resilience. Onward, Chuck's journey introduces her to trailblazing women from history, such as fossil hunter Mary Anning, oceanographer Gloria Hollister, and mountaineer Annie Peck. Figures who are often forgotten or overlooked, who forged a pathway for future generations of brave and curious women. As a young girl, books allowed me to see the world around me anew, to understand the world beyond, and to imagine a road ahead. The artistry that illustrated these pages served to expand the text and has deeply informed my visual language today. My studio methodology is a practice of imagination and research, driven by the pursuit of narrative. In the creation of a young adult chapter book, the visual components and text work together to build environment, character, mood, and emotionality. As an actor, I was trained to create a character by creating their world. In order to understand a world beyond my own experience, research and exploration were and continue to be a vital part of my practice. Research into historical figures serves to build a stockpile of visual reference for an imagined reality, one which I expand upon by posing my body and constructing models to better visualize composition. In my practice, I utilize traditional drawing mediums in order to create an illustrative approach that maintains a connection to my hand. Graphite and charcoal, in particular, have a tonal quality I find appealing when building up value and communicating light, shadow, and mood. In this project, I am exploring the addition of color by utilizing digital approaches, as well as working in watercolor and graphite to convey a quality similar to an explorer's sketchbook. As I write this story, I often imagine writing for an audience much like my 11-year-old heroine, and much like my 11-year-old self. Yet in writing a young adult fiction, I am wary of considering my work narrowly as writing for children. Author and illustrator Lauren Child explains that there is a common and lazy assumption in creating work for children in mind that it is easier or less demanding, and that a writer or artist would approach it with any lesser degree of sincerity than when creating for an adult audience. As Child states, good art is for everyone. According to writer Neil Gaiman, authors, especially children's authors, have a certain obligation to their readers to write true things, especially when we are creating tales of people who do not exist in places that never were. As Gaiman explains, fiction is the lie that tells the truth. Beginning in the 1800s, illustrated fiction grew in popularity, developing into what is often referred to as the golden age of illustration. And it is here that I began to recognize my work through a historical lens. Oil painters such as Mead Schaeffer, Howard Pyle, and N.C. Wyeth rose in prominence due to their artistic skill and ability to translate and elevate story. The 20th century also gives rise to a heightened era of illustrated fantasy and children's literature, as seen as the work of illustrators such as Arthur Rackham, whose work author C.S. Lewis once described as music made visible. At this time, a certain element of play and experimentation in the layout of text and illustration begins to appear, notable in the work of author-illustrator Beatrix Potter and illustrator E.H. Shepard, who broke form by creating illustrations that interacted with the words on the page. By utilizing the qualities of narrative composition key to the golden age of illustration, as well as the play of children's book illustrators like Potter and Shepard, I hope to build a nuanced approach to my work that honors tradition while making room for surprise and discovery. There's a certain tactile quality in the experience of a book, and an intimacy in the engagement between object and audience. Author Douglas Adams once expressed the value of physical books by relating them to sharks, stating, "Sharks have been around for a very long time. There were sharks before there were dinosaurs, and the reason sharks are still in the ocean is that nothing is better at being a shark than a shark." There are innumerable ways to tell a story, but much like sharks, books have stood the test of time, as they are better at being books than anything else. Fiction and fantasy, when presented with sincerity, allow us to enter new realms of possibility, returning to our own to consider what might be with empathy. Author Neil Gaiman asserts that through fiction, you observe things happening to other people, and in this observation are able to experience being someone else. And when you return to your own world, you are going to be slightly changed, having looked out through eyes other than your own. Writer and adventurer Freya Stark, heralded in the press as the nomad queen and the poet of travel, helped to redefine the role of women in exploration, as she celebrated travel as a means toward liberation. "I have no reason to go," said Stark, "except that I have never been, and knowledge is better than ignorance." Authors have long sought to capture the wonder of exploration and the impact of stepping into the unknown. In the novel A Hatful of Sky, writer Terry Pratchett muses, "Why do you go away? So that you can come back. So that you can see the place you came from with new eyes and extra colors." Through the device of young adult literature and illustration, I seek to continue in this legacy of authorship, reflecting on the potential of adventure to create change and expand our knowledge and understanding of the world and ourselves within it. While the history of exploration is fraught with problematic impacts of colonialism, my work can offer a space for dialogue. At its best, exploration can provide a deeper empathy and understanding of the world and others, and in examining history, my work can serve as a means for discussing what exploration might be, celebrating the potential of curiosity, while also acknowledging the hubris of our past. The written and illustrated book, as an object and art form, lends itself to a certain magic. It is comprised of recognizable components of paper, drawn marks, and an endless combination of 26 letters, which transform to create a world within the pages. When met with an audience, a book becomes a journey. The act of exploration, whether experienced on the page or on foot, changes the explorer. My work falls within a tradition of storytelling that utilizes imagined adventure grounded in recognizable truth as a means to reflect on our experience and understand a world beyond our own. The world is vast and marvelous and full of unknowns waiting to be met. To quote Dr. Seuss, "The more that you read, the more things you will know. The more you learn, the more places you'll go." Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. While we give our audience a moment to gather their thoughts and put their questions in the chat, I wonder if you might want to share a URL in the chat so people can keep exploring the work.
Let's see.
And everyone, if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to type those up and we will read them off. Excellent. I'll start off while we're waiting. Oh, wait, never mind. Shoshana beat me to it. Awesome. All right. So Shoshana asks, great job, Kate. Loved your presentation. How does autobiography figure into your work?
That's a really great question. As I was approaching this work, at first I was just very excited to find an outlet for storytelling. My background is in theater, and as I was approaching the MFA program, it was partly an opportunity to give my visual work some more love and treat it more professionally. But in lieu of the pandemic, it's an outlet that doesn't exist right now. And so there is that element of this is a way for me to continue in that practice of storytelling. But I also find that a lot of my experience coming to storytelling as a child was through picture books and young adult chapter books, and the experience of sharing that with my family and having this bonded group of my parents would read to me and we would share in that adventure of going into these stories was very influential in why I want to create this work. I also definitely know that I wanted to create something that an 11-year-old me would want to read. And I thought about the experiences that I had as a child and my love of nature and science and animals. And in a lot of ways, I do write for a younger Kate. But I also hope to incorporate those senses of like connection and family that are so important to me, as well as create a sense of a space for a child to explore and to be excited to seek the unknown.
Excellent. And next up, we have a great question from Nick. Is the Explorers Club that you physically built, but based off of any historical structures?
Not very tightly, but in a loose way. Yeah, there are historic explorers clubs that do exist. When I lived in New York, there's one that I walked by all the time and it always had this like mysterious air to it. So there are explorers clubs, and I did choose to work off of blueprints of actual old Victorian houses. So I constructed the model with paper mache and cardboard over the summer, and it really helped me to like figure out how the structure would work within the story as each room does turn into a different location. So it was kind of a combination of looking at real explorers clubs, picking what explorers were useful to my story, and then looking at actual construction and figuring out what rooms I would need to tell that story. As, for example, a bathroom becomes the ocean, the steps become a mountain, and I had to figure out what architecture was needed.
Excellent. And that sort of leads into the next question from Kaylee. Kaylee says, what a storyful experience listening to your presentation. Kate, I'd like to ask how you begin when approaching a story. What is your thought process?
I feel like a lot of it is just like daydreaming first. Like I had a couple ideas about a story that focused around explorers and focused around this idea of being able to meet people at different points in history. And then it's a lot of research, because the idea I had a year ago was so different from where I'm at now, and I'm sure it'll continue to change by the time I actually finish. But it started with that loose seed of kind of just like daydreaming fantasy, and then going into research of like, what explorers exist, which ones would help me to tell a story, which ones do I think are important, especially for young girls to hear, how can I give voice to those? And then once I collected all that data, a lot of storyboarding and outlining and free writing, and then loose first drafts and edits, and slowly it's becoming more and more specific.
Wonderful. And that sort of overlaps a little bit with Dan's question here, but maybe you can elaborate further. Dan says, such a fun presentation. How do the writing and illustrating processes influence each other? And does making illustrations influence or change how you write the story?
Definitely influences it. For this project, I've been starting primarily with the writing first. Um, and I have a draft that's about like 2/3 through and it's fully outlined. But I have definitely found that I'm storyboarding and doing character sketches along the way as I go. And those have deeply informed what I want, how I want the story to function. These sketches here at the end of Chuck's dog, a beagle named Darwin, really helped me to be like, oh, this is actually a great motivation character to move from space to space if Darwin is our guide and we're following him as we move throughout the house. So I think the storyboarding process and the character sketching actually opens up to fun surprises. So I'm like, oh, that's great. And so it, in a weird way, feels like a collaborator.